ahead.
Thank you, Susan. Last week, we learned about Native American creation stories. We heard about Lakota stories that are based on their familiarity with the sky because they live in the plains and sky is very important to them. It's very obvious. And Potawatomis who are more in the woodlands and maybe had their stories based more on plants and animals. Today, we're going to focus on stories of creation that come out of Africa. The Yoruba tribe of Nigeria, I believe, and Mali tribe, somewhere in Africa. Okay, Dogo in Mali. Okay. That's all I need to say, I think, at this point. There are handouts that come that you need to read and is preparation for next week, which is going to focus on the Bible creation stories. So read those before next week. And I understand the people that are at home will have those emailed to them. At this point, David, take it away.
I can get hooked up. Am I hooked up or not? No. Maybe I have to. Does it go behind my ear? I bet it does. Behind my thing. Like that.
That's perfect.
That's the way. And then I have to put, oh, it's on. So you hear me now?
I do. We hear you on Zoom.
Okay. Well, let's try and see how it works. So, as you know from last week, I love books. I have lots of books. So I'm going to again offer books to you. Whoa. So some of this is from last week, the video we watched. If anyone wants to take it and watch it again, you can do that. If you want a write-up of similar material, this booklet, Lakota Star Knowledge, is a wonderful overview of the Lakota tradition. And then for the Potawatomi tradition, braiding sweetgrass. Some of you may have heard of that book. It's a wonderful book, Robin Wall Kimmerer. So that book is available. You got 3 weeks. Just get it back to me. And then I read the stuff about Native American religion from God is Read by Vine Deloria. It's a great book. It's old. It's been out for 30 years. This is a new edition, but it's so you can have any of that. And then Mary Heisman, who is a Zoomer, not here, she loaned this book to me, Old Turtle, which is a wonderful kind of creation story. It's written almost like a children's story, but it's very profound. So you can have that.
I'll hand you the book so you don't have to keep going back.
Well, I don't mind. I leave the other ones there because I'm going to refer to them later.
Okay, you want me to hand it to you?
No, that's okay. My legs still work.
All right.
So today we're going to delve into at least 2 different creation traditions. The Dogon people from Mali, who have been well studied for a long time, and the Yoruba people of Nigeria. I want to give you a perspective on anthropologists. That was my academic training. The school that was well known for me when I started out was called structural functionalism. Radcliffe Brown was the major purveyor of that. And structures were how you observed in a community, in a society, the different structures that existed. And the purpose was, how do they function? How do they relate to people in their activities? That's what structural functionalism is. Sometimes it's referred to as the British school, because most of the anthropologists that used that approach came out of England. They were almost all male. There's a few females like Mary Douglas, but most of them were male. And who did they talk to? Other men. So the slant of structural functionalism was always a slant towards men and what men did. Very little of it was, any focus on women was very secondary. It was not the major focus. So the alternative school, which if any of you have read any anthropology at all, Claude Lévi-Strauss was a primary person of the French school. Their interest was in myth and cosmology, a totally different perspective than what the British school had. And so the Dogon people that we're going to read, that was part of the French culture, because French West Africa, which has a number of different countries now, was a large swath of land in between the coast and the Sahel. And whereas the Yoruba were part of the British culture, which, you know, when the scramble for Africa came, the explorers would go with a flag over their shoulder, and as far as they could get, they would plant the flag. And that's how they would mark out these domains of colonialism. The underlying assumption, of course, was these are pagan people, uncivilized people. We have to come into their area and civilize them. That was at least what was stated on the offset. The bottom line, of course, of colonialism was nothing about training people. It was about exploitation of resources. That's what colonial governments did. And so in that mad scramble for Africa in the middle of the 19th century, that's what the colonial governments would do. They'd send out their ambassadors to try to stake out their land. And then they would squabble with each other about which piece of this land really belonged to the French and which belonged to the British. And then in other parts, the Portuguese entered into it, and the Belgians in the Congo. But the main contenders, at least in West Africa and East Africa, were the French and the British. So that's kind of an overview of how anthropologists worked. They worked by the blessing of the colonial government. That's how they got into the different places they went. And so none of them, until after the independence movement, were critical of colonial policies, because that was the hand that fed them. And they were not going to critique those colonial governments, those colonial policies. So that's a quick overview. The Dogon, if you remember your little geography of Africa, of West Africa, the Niger River empties out into the ocean in Nigeria, hence the name Nigeria. It curves north and then makes a big bend near the famous town of Timbuktu, and then curves back to the west and to the south. So it makes this great big arc that empties out into Nigeria. The Dogon people lived in what is now currently Mali, part of French West Africa, and hence French speaking. And their area that they lived in was a little bit south of the river. And the river is just a little bit south of Timbuktu. If you can look it up on an African map and get a sense about it. The Dogon people were fascinating to a variety of people who heard about them because they had the most advanced cosmology of any of the African peoples. All of the African peoples have creation stories, but they had a very elaborate cosmological orientation in which everything in society was correlated with their cosmological motifs. And in the Dogon people, there were connections with the stars, not the same way that Lakota had, but not totally dissimilar. So I want to read to you a creation story from the Dogon. Now I could have had you here, but
How do you spell Dogon?
D-O-G-O-O-N, D-O-G-O-N. The two primary researchers, and if anyone really wants to tackle good, complicated stuff, one is Marcel Gourier, and the other, his friend, was Patrilineal. Marcel worked in the area of not only the Dogon, but other peoples for 30 years. He would get funding and he would go on these trips. And so the first product, not necessarily the first thing that he produced, was called Conversations with Ogoto Temeli, who was an elder from the Dogon people. And the story is that the elders, when he first wanted to start doing research with them, had a serious conversation about, do we really want this white intruder to know our secrets? Because they were a culture much different than some of the other African cultures, which was not interested in assimilation to Western ways. They stuck to their traditions, and I don't know what it's like now, some 40 years after this research was done. But this book is done in 31 days, 33 days, in which every day he would meet with him and talk about different parts of their cosmology. And there was a recorder that was present, so would record the conversations, and this book was a product of it. It's a most fascinating read if you really want to spend some time going back over it. A different book, The Pale Fox, by the same authors, deals more precisely with the creation stories, because the pale fox fits into that, and I'll read you a little section of that. If you're not interested in doing the whole big shot, in this book, African Worlds, is a chapter on the Dogon people. And you could read that as a bedtime story. Maybe it would be a little more complicated than that, but so I want to read to you. Oh, wait a minute. Let me just make a couple comments about a couple other books. This is going back to the structural functionalist school, a collection of essays on African systems of kinship and marriage. They were particularly interested in kinship and marriage. Maybe they were too much products of Victorian England, but that was utterly fascinating to them. How do these pagans work together? And so typically an anthropologist would go into a village, and the first task that they would take after getting to know people and making themselves known would be to do a genealogy of everybody in the village. Who is related to who? How do kinship patterns get orientated in that society? And of course, one of the overriding themes always was, is it a matrilineal society or a patrilineal society? Because they have very different rules of behavior and relationship, depending on, in those patrilineal and matrilineal societies exist throughout Africa. So it's one of the primary orienting formats for understanding. And of course, then marriage is part of that, because each culture has rules about who can marry and who cannot, and who can sleep with, and all of that stuff. So it was an interesting, fascinating thing. Now, two more books here. If you want to read a different creation story, the Mewindo Epic is a story from the Bashonga people, who are from the Congo. Again, a French-speaking country, Belgium, but French-speaking. So they were more interested in, the writers of this were more interested in their cosmology and their mythic structure. And then this is an African writer who actually just started publishing probably about 10, 15 years ago. Maldoma Patrilineal, French name. And he writes of his people, his own people, the Dagara, who actually live in Ghana, but are influenced by the neighboring French culture. And his first book was on the initiation rites that he personally experienced growing up amongst the Dagara. So they're also quite fun to read. So I think that's all my show and tell stuff. All right, the Dogon. This is a little write-up about the creation myths of the Dogon. And it's only a couple pages long, and I thought I would read it because it gives you a perspective of how their creation stories materialized. So, the Dogon of Mali are unusual in having developed an elaborate cosmology and highly complex cosmology. Cosmology deals with spacing of stuff, whereas cosmology is the correlations between reality. The creation myths, which I shall summarize below, are collected and pieced together over a number of years by Gruele and Deuteronomy, the two books I mentioned to you. My interpretations adheres closely to their own analysis and points of view. In their view, the creation myths provides the symbolic categories by which the Dogon understand and organize their world. And they do organize their world. Even their houses are organized based on the creation myths symbol, and their fields that they plant in are all organized based on how their creation myth. It's really fascinating. In their view, the creation myths provides the symbolic categories by which the Dogon understand and organize their world, and it provides the ritual patterns by which the Dogon seek to maintain the world in existence. I shall also indicate how the creation myth explains the world in terms of binary structure. Binary structure in the original creation myth, there was the birthing of twins, a male and female twin, and that symbol of two twins pervades throughout the whole creation story. I mean, in that sense, it's not different than what we'll deal with next week. Male and female, God created them. In the beginning, Amma, A-M-M-A, the supreme God, existed alone and depended on nothing but himself. Sounded all familiar? Amma had the shape of an oval egg made out of his 4 collar bones joined together. The bones divided the egg into 4 quarters, the 4 directions, the 4 elements, fire, air, earth, and water, and the joints between the bones represented the 4 cardinal directions of space. The morphology of the cosmic egg thus contained both the substance and structure of the universe. Amma traced within himself the designs of the cosmos and its future development by placing in the egg 266 cosmic signs, and those signs are important in their whole way of organizing life. These signs manifested the creative thought of Amma, and they contained the structure, essence, and life principles of all things. After making the 266 signs, Amma embarked upon the creation of the world. He placed the 4 elements and the signs together with the seeds of plants and the crops in a flat disc, and set the disc revolving between the cosmic axis. But as the disc began to spin, it threw out the water, drying up the seeds. The creation was a failure. That sounded all familiar too? Amma destroyed it and began again. This time he would make mankind, humankind, the instrument for preserving the order and life of the world. Amma began his second creation by placing a tiny seed grain within himself in the center of the cosmic egg. Into this grain, he spoke 7 creative words, 7, bearing the creative force, Nayama, of sacred speech. This caused the seed to vibrate 7 times and to turn in a spiral fashion, extending itself in 7 directions within the womb of the egg. The 7 professions prefigured in anthropomorphic shape the image of man around which the world would be organized. This second projection, however, broke through its enveloping sheath and produced a separate segment which was shorter than the others and incomplete. It represented the principle of incompleteness, imperfection, singularity, disorder, which together with the principle of completeness, perfection, duality, order, constitute the structure of the dynamic of the Dogon people. This was foreseen and determined by Anna from the beginning. Amma then transformed the egg into a double placenta. That's where you get the double placenta. In each placed a set of twins, male and female. Before the process of gestation was complete, one of the males, named Ogo, became impatient. He feared that Amma would not give him his female counterpart after birth, despite Amma's assurance. Ogo grew increasingly anxious, feeling that desperately alone and incomplete, he would no longer wait for the completion of the gestation process, which took 60 years. Instead, he burst forth from his placenta with the intention of seizing his twin for himself before the time of birth. But Amma had foreseen Ogo's revolt and removed his twin to the other placenta. Unable to recover his twin, Ogo revolted completely. He broke out of the cosmic rules, tried to take over all the secrets of the universe for himself with the intention of creating another world. He traversed the area inside the cosmic egg in a spiral motion, contrary to the original spiral direction, and therefore imposed his own disorder upon the creative process. He declared himself to be as wise as Amma and capable of creating his own universe, for he knew that Amma had implanted within him the important signs, words, and seeds of creation. He stole what he thought was the original seeds, grain, intending to create a new world of his own, but this seed turned out to contain only the seeds of inedible plants and insects. When Oga tried to utter the sacred words, he discovered that he lacked the special quality of speech with which to say them properly and thus launch a new creation. And so it goes on with Ogo trying to do this alternative creation story or creation world. And finally, Amma, meanwhile, Amma transformed Oga into an animal called the pale fox. Remember the one book, The Pale Fox? And the pale fox fits prominently within the creation story. Solitary and incomplete, always in revolt, the fox now wanders over the surface of the earth in a fruitless quest for his female soul. The pale fox is the forerunner whose steps reveal the dangers man must avoid in the course of his wanderings. The pale fox guides humankind through the mysteries of life by the tracks he leaves on the ground, which are interpreted by the Dogon diviners. So that's just sort of a brief overview of the Dogon cosmology and creation stories. It's a fascinating thing. And if I was more skilled, I'd do more of the whole creation sequence as the Dogon understand it. But it would be like the 19th century, the Dogon people were well known as a people who had a very elaborate cosmological understanding of their world, different than most other African groups have creation stories, but not this is elaborate as the Dogon. So, any comments or questions?
Raise your hand and I'll come to you, and then maybe we'll repeat the question so that Paul can hear.
I don't have anything in the chat.
Well, I guess that's it, huh? All right. So I think that's as much as I want to say about the Dogon. So let me talk a little bit about the Yoruba. When the British took over what is now known as Nigeria, there were three primary ethnic groups that functioned in different parts of modern day Nigeria. The Yoruba in the West, who probably have the most elaborate kind of mythic structure of any of them, and then the Igbo in the East, and the Hausa in the North. Those three groups of people, large ethnic groups, started feuding with each other almost from the get-go, because it was a major mistake of British colonialism to put these large, diverse ethnic groups into the same geographical space. It would have been much more sensible for the British to have created three separate countries, if you wish. So initially, the conflict was between the Yoruba in the West and the Igbo in the East. And some of you may remember the Biafra War, which was from the Igbo in the East, who rebelled against this whole configuration. Of course, on top of that, the Igbo knew already that they were on these vast oil fields, which are much more problematic now even than they were then, because shale oil, the primary excluder of this oil wealth, tramples over the well-beings of the people. And they've left countless people in severe malnutrition because they take over their farms, their plants, in order to put in their oil wells. So then in modern days, the conflict has been more between the Hausa in the north and the two southern parts, because the Hausa readily adapted to Islam. And so now typically you talk about Islam in the north, or Muslims in the north, and Christians in the south. And the Igbos, and even more so the Yoruba, readily adapted to Christianity. And so when you go into a Yoruba town, which I was able to do in the early 80s, churches are the dominant piece in the landscape. Almost all Church of England churches, but a few other Protestant churches. And then always, even in a Yoruba town, there would be a mosque, and you would wake up early in the morning with somebody standing up at the parapet of the mosque, calling the people into worship. So, and by the way, the Yoruba, and actually all three groups, don't do well with birth control. So it's the most populous country in Africa. And because of that population, they have their own problems that have compounded it. So in the research of the Yoruba, most of the researchers, again, were male. And they didn't do very much with the women because the women were secondary. But along came, and I'm going to get my other book. Oh, it's up here. Sorry. A number of female researchers, Judith Gleason is the author of this book called Oya in Praise of the Goddess. The goddess Oya was particularly connected to the women marketers. How many male anthropologists are going to dare to go in amongst a bunch of women at the market and start talking to them about their stories? They just don't do that. They'd rather go to the men who are sitting out under the shade of a tree and talk to them about their understanding of creation, understanding of the order of things. So Judith was not only a skilled ethnographer, that is, collecting stories, but she had roots in comparative literature. So one of the things that she does is to correlate her understanding of Oya with the writings of African writers. She refers particularly to Kamra Lai, who wrote a book in French called The African Child. And she refers a lot to Leopold Senghor, one-time president of Senegal, who was a poet, a dramatist, wrote some short stories, a very prolific writer. And so what she does in this book, which is called Oya, that's the name of the goddess. At the very beginning of it, she has a collection of praise songs to Oya. There's 3 of them. I'm not going to read all 3, but I am going to read one because it's done as if it's a song type of thing. In fact, typically in the marketplace, when you would have a gathering of the women to tell the stories about Oya, they would sing the songs. So it goes like this. Aya o, Oya o, Mother Oya. It is not from today that she is honorable, but from long ago. She arrives at witch's house dragging muddy feet, Egun of Alga, huge cloth. And that was one of the things of the women when they would act out her story, would wear these billowing cloth outfits. There's a bit of a masquerade in almost all African cultures when they do myth and ritual. And some of it's with masks, and others of it is just dependent on what else you put on your body. She dances, she dares confine the elder in his room, flood who prevents everyone from leaving the house. And she's connected to water, the Niger River, but she's particularly connected to tornadoes. Aya o, Oya o, Mother Oya. She's the one who employs truth against wickedness. She stands in the frontier between life and death. Customs officers of multitudes, wife of Ogon. She picks up the drum to play and tore it to pieces. She danced under the Ogon tree and tore that to pieces. Aya o, Oya o. There's an element of danger in connecting to any of these gods and goddesses in the African traditions. They're not to be approached lightly, sort of the way we tend to approach our own God. She's the one who makes a pact with someone wanting to bear a child and doesn't break it. She carries the lamp into the house and strolls around leisurely, pacing in circles, waiting for the Creator to come. Do you think you are safe in the house? If you think too much about her, you probably won't run into her. She quarrels with you, you never win. Even if she doesn't quarrel with you, she'll terrify. Everything she does is a big production. Aya, oh, oya, oh. If it's a whirling beat, she'll dance to it. Wits, bembe, she'll dance to it. Oh, she'll dance to it. Who dances to bata drums? Oh, she dances to them. Who dances to shakari? Oh, she dances to it. Wife of Ogon, that's the one who dances it, whatever it is. She has been performing, Egon, in a lot of these words you won't know, but masquerade for a long, long time. Oya had so much honor, she turned around and became Oshra. Oya guards the road into the world and out of it. Oya respects to the awesome. So interestingly, the Oya tradition, she has followed it not just among the Yoruba in Nigeria, but to Brazil, where there's a very large Oya reverence, to New York City, to other parts of the Western Hemisphere, wherever it would take her. This was the kind of research she did. So this is a little bit of a story of creation that begins with her meeting with a woman called Madame Kanye, Paris, May 23, 1976. I call and invite Madame Game to lunch. It is Sunday. She accepts immediately. I am grateful. It is somehow crucial that we talk. I know that Nade and Oya are sisters. The bond makes formalities fall away. All the same, it's kind of her to free herself in such a short notice. Our neglectfully unrestricted table is placed so far out on the sidewalk that fumes of the Boulevard Saint-Germain traffic invade and disguise the images of our aperitifs. I'm embarrassed. She, gracious, but this awkwardness does not last for long. All noise vanishes in the intensity of our conversation. Her brown eyes, like those of a childhood friend, like those of a helpful animal in a fairy tale, like those of someone under a spell who is trying to convey the sorrow of her imprisonment, hold mine in steady gaze as first her hands, then a low, urgent voice began to speak. She is telling me a myth. Having pressed her palms together with great effort, now she pulls them apart. Creation has occurred. Consciousness has been dramatically severed from itself. Now there are two parts of it. From a secret recess, a self-containing sphere, suddenly God thought, And that suddenly, said the Countess, was the earliest insistence of what later became known as Nyla, pure impulse. Now comes the explanation to accomplish thought. The perfect spear had to divide slightly so that one part could reflect the other. Seeing himself as double meant that within the narrow separation between the hemispheres of God were simultaneously created life, light, distance, and time. And God heard upon this instant his own inner voice in the form of a vibration, which will subsequently animate the entirety of what is beginning to be created. Not totally dissimilar from the creation myth of the Dogon people. Implicit in this initial act are all four elements, she explained. Wind, together with fire, subtly initiating the process. Water reflects and thereby verbalize act into being. Earth provides resistance as witness to tension in her hands as she tried to pull them slightly apart. Earth is the half preventing diffusion of spirit and ensuring that what is said will be heard, will endure. It is the implicit element of earth and engraves water's sinuous memories upon the brains of evolving creatures. Alone, the Countess continued, Nyla dispersed creative word throughout space, touching all four directions into existence. She traveled as a whirlwind, alone born of herself by her own immensity. Nyla carried us on the self-appointed task. So air striking against air ignites fire, further accelerating air's displacement. However, Nyla was not as alone as she thought. As she spoke, from the mouth issues a mist. So Pharaoh, the great androgynous water spirit, was concealed within the vibrations of the created world Nyla was spreading through space. Eventually, feeling the drag of his moisture, which threatened to deprive her of such exhilarating exclusivity, Nyla sped up, becoming ever more ardent, more violent, effectively evaporating all the moisture enveloping the word. The moisture shriveled into a scum like the dry foam found where the waters of a pond have receded. Thus, wishing to destroy water, she inadvertently caused Naimaduro, earth, to appear. For that scum solidified it itself, acquired bulk, and became the second and final obstacle to her power. The Countess paused as in her narration. We had hit the bottom and stayed there wordlessly, stayed with it. The streak of unconscious controlled energy, that primary illusion of impotence by which impulsive women have been just as suddenly mortified as we were then staring at the gleaming tablecloth with all the clutter. No more space then that divided us. And so she goes on about water and earth. And so that's just what this Countess told her about creation. Most of this book is not so much about creation as such, but it's dealing with more often with women power. Part 2 is of masquerades and women power. And so she talks a lot about masquerades, because that's a very important ritual part in any African tradition, is the masquerades, because the person who has the masquerade has the power of whatever masquerade they're wearing. And so it becomes a powerful way of re-entering into the stories, the origins of what the stories point to. So that is a little bit of Oya, the goddess. And most male anthropologists knew nothing about Oya, because they had male deities that they dealt with and not female deities. So it took not only Judith, but other in the 1970s and on, a lot of women anthropologists started doing research in Africa and other parts of the world. And they painted a totally different picture of what life was like than what their male counterparts had done for years. So I entered anthropology in the 70s, and it was pretty much a male world at that time. But soon after, it began to divert into a much more feminine kind of perspective. And I gave you, by the way, a reading for next week, the second creation story by Phyllis Tribble, one of the primary feminists of theology. And it's a whole different perspective on the first creation story, but we'll get to that next week. So any comments about either of these African traditions? I think I'm not.
Traditions that don't include gods.
Are there traditions? I think most of the traditions that I know of in African culture have a god that is usually a single god creator force. And then quite often, like in the Dogon, where it's an egg, the egg separates into either male, female, or earth and whatever, so that the god, there's a single god, and then that god becomes the source of the creation process. So it's different than our creation story, where God is sort of up above it all.
More like an Aristotelian first cause.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question for the Zoom audience, please?
Oh, the question is, sorry. The question is, are there traditions in Africa that don't have a God figure as part of their creation story? And I said that in most African religious traditions, there is a God figure that's pretty prominent. And so when the missionaries came, whether they're Muslim missionaries or Christian, to talk about a God figure, that was not so much of a problem. There was just other stuff with that God figure that became much more problematic.
More about matrilineal and patrilineal societies. Do the ones that are matrilineal means that they trace their genealogy through mothers rather than through fathers? And then do they also then have any god that was a female as a powerful figure, and the patrilineal a male god, or are there some variations there? Question.
All right, the question is about matrilineal and patrilineal traditions, and how do the gods figure in that? As far as I know, most matrilineal societies still have a God figure that in a certain sense is neither male nor female, but there is a central God figure. But in the matrilineal society, while the line of descent goes through the female, that is, Jane's children are all going to be part of her kinship line. But because too often men have a dominating factor, it becomes her brothers who are the ones who are the keepers of the kinship. So the line of descent is with the female. So it's the uncle of the product who becomes kind of the gatekeeper, if you wish. So that's the matrilineal, whereas patrilineal, and there's probably equal number in African societies of both matrilineal and patrilineal. The group I grew up with, the Mbun, they were matrilineal. That is, the line of descent went through the woman, but they were patriarchal in the sense that it was men who had the authority. So it's important to know the difference between patriarchal and patrilineal. And most matrilineal societies still had a patriarchal system. There's some exceptions to that. There are some societies where really women were the rulers. They were the chiefs, they were the authority figure, but that's not very normative.
There are a couple questions in the chat. Could I go ahead and address those?
Would these women have several husbands? I'm more familiar with men having many wives. Would the powerful women have many husbands? Or is that rare?
The question is about polygamy. The dominant force in most African societies was men having more than one wife, but it was always based on status. That is, if you were higher up in the social hierarchy, it was almost incumbent on you to have more than one wife, because one of the factors of marriage in most African societies was bride price. So the person whose wife was coming into the family, that family had to pay either in goats or some other form of exchange for the services, if you wish, of the woman. So there were societies, not many, but there were a few societies, I remember researching this, where women had more than one spouse. But usually it was not the same dynamic as a male having in his compound more than one wife. It was more that she had other male friends that she could cohabit with, and they were sort of loosely thought of as her husbands, but it was an accepted thing that she as a female would have more than one male consort. But that was not the normative thing.
Any chats, questions or comments you want to share with us?
How did the Oya get to Brazil, that tradition?
The question is about how did Oya get to Brazil? It goes back to the slave trade, because African slaves were taken not only to this country, but they were taken to other parts of the hemisphere, to Brazil, to Haiti. And so the farmers or the slaves would take with them their religious traditions. And in some places like Brazil, those African traditions flourished much better than they did in this country, because the slave masters in this country did everything possible to get rid of the African traditions and ways of life. They couldn't completely eradicate them, but they would try. Hence, they would not allow them to read, for example, to learn how to read, because that would give them access to power. So.
I have a few questions in the chat. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We might be going back a little ways, but did the white man introduce any changes to the story of a Dogon, causing them to think differently?
Well, the question is, how much influence did European societies have on peoples like the Dogon? Most African societies were quite adaptable to whatever the missionaries brought. You read some of the novels like Chinua Achebe from Nigeria about how the impact of Westernization had on traditional cultures. One of the histories, at least up until maybe the 70s, was that the Dogon people, probably because they were quite remote and they lived up into some highlands, that they were able to resist Westernization more than other societies. Now, how it is now, some 50 years after those books were written, I don't have a handle on that. But most African societies, because it was the dominant colonial motif, adapted fairly well to Westernization because it was the dominant political economic force that they would have to contend with. So I don't have an answer specifically on the Dogon, but I mean, most people resisted Western intrusion, at least up to a point. You have another one?
Yeah, I do. What happened to the female part of the egg when Ogo became impatient?
Well, in the story, at least in the creation story, the god took the other female part and put it with the other part of the placenta to preserve it. And by doing that, it got preserved eventually. It did become the alternative female part of the young male who was impatient. But it's kind of a story that, if you wish, it's sort of the introduction of evil into the world, and how does the world contend with that introduction of evil, which is similar to the story we'll deal with next time in Genesis 2 and 3. So most creation stories begin with a sometimes failed creation. We heard that in the Dogon myth, but sometimes it's really a very beautiful creation. And then somewhere along the way, something comes along that messes it up. And then the creation story has to deal with how do you respond to this intrusion. Got anything more from Zoom?
Thank you. No, there's nothing else in the chat.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to get out of here early. Okay.
Do you have any kind of specific example of the Dogon and how the cosmology affected the arrangement of the houses for the fields? You had mentioned that, and I wanted to something, just one little specific thing that they did.
Okay, let me see if I can get the question right. Some little specific thing that the Dogon did in their creation story. Okay, wait a minute. I missed it.
You had mentioned they Dogon, they arranged their houses
Yes.
right to fit with their cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have one thing that they would have done? Yeah. I mean, where did the chairs fit? That kind of stuff.
Okay, I don't have the graph right here, but there was a picture in here of, oh, the question is a specific about how the creation story impacts on how they arrange their world. So there was an image in here of a chief's house. And it was clear in looking at this that there had to be very specific places. So for example, granaries, because these were an agricultural people that lived on millet as the primary grain. The granaries were 4 corners of the house. So each granary storage area had to have its corner representing the 4 directions, the 4 elements. And so that was one specific that I remember.
Any other examples of the structural functionalism approach? What other structures would they be looking at other than say maybe arrangement of their homes?
Well, the issue about the Dogon is not a structural functional approach. I mean, we tend to think that way. We tend to think that whatever people do in their cultural way of life has a particular function in how they behave. But the writers of the Dogon people were not influenced in that. They were more connected to how does it relate to myths. So when let me take an example about a structural functional approach to our life and how it breaks down. Communion, Eucharist. We talk about it as feeding at the Lord's table, right? I mean, that's the symbolism of it, but you're not going to get very much food out of that. So it doesn't have a real function in society about the Eucharist. It has a mythic element to it. And so we're reenacting the myth of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, but we're not having any function of it. I mean, maybe the coffee hour afterwards might be functional in that you can imbibe in some goodies and get your way home before you starve to death. But I mean, so a structural functional approach to the Eucharist would have a hard time trying to say what is the function of the Eucharist. Whereas a French writer who was interested in mythic elements would have no trouble in dealing with that because it's more connected to myth than it is to an actual function of the society. Does that make any sense?
You want to talk about what to prepare for next week?
All right, just for you to remember, in the book of Genesis, you start off with the creation story of the 7 days of creation. And we think that's the first story. But the book of Genesis, as well as the whole of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah we call, or the 5 books of Moses, have 4 strands of writing that are all combined together. And biblical scholars learn how to identify which strand it is. So the oldest strand, which is what we call the Yahwist strand, and that's based partly on because the name of God that appears in that oldest strand is always Yahweh. The second strand is often called the E strand or Elohist because the Hebrew name for God is Elohim or some variation of that. So those are the 2 primary strands. But then the final shape of the first 5 books of the Torah didn't get put together until after captivity in Babylon. And so there's 2 more strands that come in during that period, the last of which is called the P or the priestly tradition, which was the ones who combined them all together. And so therefore, Genesis 1 and 2 seem like it's one continuous story when it's not. It's two very different stories coming out of two very different time periods.
And the third strand is the Deuteronomic.
The Deuteronomic, because the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, was composed sort of right in time, in that captivity time, either just before or during or just after. We'll talk more about that next time, but we'll make Old Testament scholars out of you after all. All right, anything else? Thank you all. And remember, you can borrow any of these books if you want to. Judith will record them.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And for those of you who are at home, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Have a great day.